Okay, I think I will start. We're 5 minutes into it, so we've given a chance for the latecomers. Can everyone hear me? I hope so. Welcome to another TrAIN event in the series, the TrAIN Open series. I'm Michael Asbury. I'm TrAIN's Deputy Director. TrAIN stands for the Research Center for Transnational Arts, Identity and Nation. But before I introduce our very special guest today, I'd just like to go over some housekeeping issues. This presentation will consist of a conversation between myself and artist Daiara Tukano. It should last about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, something like that. At which point we will open the session for questions and comments from the audience. As this is a webinar, I would ask people to place their questions and comments within the Q&A box, which we will find at the bottom of the window, the Zoom window. And please place your questions and comments as we go along, so that when we finish, hopefully we have kind of a collection of comments, and I'll be happy to read them. If you wish to remain anonymous, please indicate so. Otherwise, I will mention who has placed the question or the comments. So without further ado, I'm delighted to have with us, after so many attempts, I mean, Daiara has been so busy. So I'm delighted to have with us artist and activist and researcher, Daiara Tukano. And I'll try to pronounce her name and several names in which I'll probably make a mess of, but please correct me, Daiara, if I get anything terribly wrong. Daiara Hori Figueroa Sampaio, a traditional Duigo name, belongs to the Eremiri Hausiro Pameri, she's laughing, indigenous clan of the Yepa Masan people. I probably completely destroyed those terms, but I'm very sorry. Better known as the Tukano. Daiara is an artist, an independent communicator, an indigenous rights activist, and a human rights researcher. Her work and research focuses on traditions and spirituality of her people, especially through the study of the Hori. And I've tried to translate this term, the Hori, which means something between design, light, gaze, or vision. To this end, Daiara dedicates herself to apprehending the visions she attains in her dreams and in the studies that she undertakes with her family, while also observing the paintings found on traditional objects in her culture, such as weavings, the basketry, ceramics, the benches and body paintings, which allude to the memory of the same history of transformation, that is the Tukano's history of humanity. As an artist, she articulates an investigation into her people's culture and the experimentation of forms and light, seeking to understand the density of the vibrations, as well as how they affect us on multiple levels. Daiara has a bachelor's degree in fine arts and a master's degree in human rights, both from the University of Brasília, the capital, Brasília, Brazil's capital, Brasília's university. She was the coordinator of the Rádio Yandê, the first indigenous web radio in Brazil, which and she took that position from 2005 to 2021, so quite recently. During her career as an artist, she was awarded several prizes, included the PIPA Online Prize in 2021 and the Prince Claus Prize in 2022. Daiara Tukano has been invited to several exhibitions, including the 30th exhibition program at the Centro Cultural São Paulo in 2020, when she executed the project Pameri Yukesi. Recent group shows include Brasil Futuro, or Future Brazil, and I'll try to read these in English just to go quicker. The forms of democracy at the National Museum of the Republic in Brasília in 2023. In 2022, she was part of the Brazilian Histories at MASP, the Museum of Art of São Paulo, of Contra-Memória, Counter Memory, at the Municipal Chapel, Municipal Theatre in São Paulo, and Brazil and Brazilianity, and postmodern Brazilianity at the Centro Cultural of the Brazil Bank. Daiara also curated in 2022 Nye e Porã at the Museum of the Portuguese Language in São Paulo, an exhibition that focused on indigenous languages in Brazil, and there are many of those. In 2021, she participated in the show Ka Body, Cosmovision of the Rainforest at Paradise Row in London. And in 2020, she was amongst those selected for the 34th São Paulo Biennial, whose title was Though It's Dark, Still I Sing. Also in 2020, she was part of Mokeng Surari, Indigenous Contemporary Art at the Museum of Modern Art in São Paulo, as well as Vexoa, Nós Sabemos, or Vexoa, We Know, at the Pinacoteca of the State of São Paulo. And there are many other exhibitions, such as Lettres au Vieux Monde in Geneva, Switzerland, Trans Macunaíma, O Buraco é Mais Embaixo, which means the problem is far more complex than you can imagine, at the Memorial of the Indigenous Peoples in Brasília in 2018, and so forth and so on. Her latest exhibition was her first solo show at the Galeria Millan in São Paulo, and I have some images from that show which I can share during our conversation. So welcome Daiara, and thank you very much for being with us here at Virtual TrAIN. If I could start by asking a question. I mean, in the run-up of this conversation, I was kind of following you on Instagram, and I saw that you were part of this quite large manifestation of indigenous peoples in Brasília. I was particularly interested in a speech you gave at a seminar, a seminar at the Congress in the Deputies Chamber, in which you spoke about the relations between national education policy and indigenous rights, and in particular how you used a kind of a specific notion of culture in order to articulate these two issues within the kind of Brazilian kind of political horizon. Perhaps you could begin by speaking a little bit about what that manifestation constituted of, and maybe perhaps mentioning a few points in that speech that you gave at Congress.
Okay.
Oh, actually, and I should mention that during those manifestations, you caught a terrible cold, and so I'm particularly kind of thankful and sorry that you have to kind of struggle with your sore throat throughout this conversation.
Well, thank you, Michael, for the invitation. This opportunity to be here with you today. Mm, so on April is our national gathering, the most important indigenous gathering in Brazil is the Acampamento Terra Livre. We could translate it as Free Land Camp. This year we gather more than 6,000 indigenous leaders from all over the country. It is the largest indigenous gathering in the world. It's more than national. It became international in the last years because we also received indigenous representatives from other countries, and this year is a really special year because for the first time, Brazilian government created a ministry for indigenous peoples, and with an indigenous woman as minister, and also it's the first time we have an indigenous woman as president of the National Foundation for the Indigenous Peoples, the FUNAI. That was the main institution responsible of indigenous affairs in Brazil, that was created in the 70s. Before that, we had another institution that was the Service of Protection for the Indians, that was created just in the beginning of the 20th century, another historical moment. And we have also our third indigenous federal deputy, that is Célia Chacriabá. So this year we gather also to celebrate those conquests. That is indigenous representability in the executive power, as something that never happened before. And we had our federal deputy Célia Chacriabá made this first seminary on indigenous peoples at the Deputies Chamber, the National Chamber, and so I had the opportunity to participate. At this moment, we also have been through the pandemics and all the situation with the previous government, the Jair Bolsonaro's government, that was openly against indigenous peoples and indigenous rights, and that worked a lot to dismantle a lot of the institutional ways that we built over decades of indigenous movements to protect our territory and to have public policies to attend the demands of the indigenous population in Brazil. So it's really, I'm trying to make it short, but to understand the importance of that moment, you really need to understand that is a long way to have the recognition of our existence. And we are talking about Brazil, that is one of the countries with the largest indigenous population and with the largest diversity of indigenous peoples in the world. We are more than 350 indigenous peoples that speak almost 200 indigenous living languages. Each indigenous nation is a civilization apart. So we are talking about complex cultures and groups that are resisting and surviving all the violences of colonization and invasion of our territories. And the building of the rights that we have today have cost many lives and lots of effort from our leaders. We want to recognize as full civilians, citizens, until 88, that is the proclamation of the actual constitution that we have today. Before that, we were considered as incapable people under the mentorship of the state, and that didn't have the right to have even all the civilian documents, as for example a passport.
You mentioned earlier on when we were kind of preparing this webinar, you gave an example, but before I ask you to maybe
I'm going there.
maybe discuss that example about your father's role in this kind of slow but gradual kind of involvement of indigenous peoples within the kind of the sphere of national politics. Perhaps I could just interrupt to say that it kind of doesn't really make sense to speak of the indigenous peoples, all of these that you mentioned, with almost 200 different languages, etc., within a strictly kind of national sense either. Artists such as Jimmy Durham have been kind of arguing that there is a kind of a closer relation between the indigenous peoples of the Americas that cannot be kind of separated by nation, and he would criticize. I think he proposed a boycott of the São Paulo Biennial, for example, in 2006, and one of his arguments is that the kind of Brazilian people of European descent still, as late as 2006, would still say are Indians, kind of meaning this kind of referring to this kind of perhaps this idea of mentorship or which you refer to in the example of your father and Maria Juruna. I took some images of this kind of pioneering indigenous politician from the 1980s. You were talking about the new constitution that was created in '88 following the military regime. But Maria Juruna was an incredible character, the first indigenous federal deputy. So he was at the Congress in Brasília, still during the military regime, admittedly during the kind of the last years. But perhaps you could speak a little bit about Juruna and his kind of campaign to denounce the general kind of sphere of political corruption, and also your father's involvement in that campaign.
So we live in a very racist continent, and something that people from other places sometimes struggle to understand, that the Americas, that piece of land that is between the North and South Pole, and we had our originary population decimated in the first century of invasion of our territories by the Europeans. In the first 100 years, more than 100 million people died. And here we are in the only continent where the originary population, the indigenous population, are the tiniest minority of all. If you go to Africa, you see a lot of African descent and African people and Black people. If you go to Asia, you see a lot of Asian people, and if you go to Europe, lots of European. But if you come to the Americas and go to the largest cities, people treat indigenous peoples as something rare, because we are We were literally decimated, and we still live in a society that still replies lots of prejudice and racist ideas against our population, and so we had also lots of official policies, historical policies of extermination, integration, annihilation of the indigenous cultures, and kind of integration. They had this idea that we were supposed to stop being Indians, stop being indigenous at some time, if we proceed to embrace Western culture, Western civilization, Western science, Western technologies, etc. But that didn't happen. It happened on some ways because of the strength of the violence that was set upon us, but we still have all this lots of nations, hundreds of indigenous nations that still resist. And so during the 60s, during the 60s, we had the rise of the national indigenous movements in all over the countries, in every country, as a national organized movement, as a social movement, in all the countries of the Americas, like from Canada to Chile. We had the rising of the indigenous movements, conduced, directed by indigenous leaders that were debating the creation, the recognition of indigenous rights, and fighting to have these rights recognized in their national constitutions. And so Mario Juruna was the first indigenous deputy that participated to the writing of the actual constitution, that was promulgada, that was signed in '88. And well, we have in the 5th chapter 2 articles. The first article is the 231, that recognize the existence of indigenous peoples, recognize our right to culture and to our originary practices and knowledges, and the territory. And the second article, that is the 322, the Brazilian state recognized the obligation of the state of recognizing indigenous territories, like regulamentar, demarcar.
Regulating. No?
Yeah, regulate indigenous territories and implement public policies for indigenous populations to grant the right to the culture and to the territory. And so it was a big win. The Brazilian Constitution is the first national constitution that actually recognized indigenous rights on that way. And after that, other countries made the ways to have the indigenous territories recognized. Indigenous territories in Brazil are not a private property that belongs to indigenous peoples, but we have territories that belong to the state, but como fala usufruto?
They can be used, or they can be
okay, these are national
people can
territories that
benefit
are
from them.
granted for permanent use of indigenous
Yeah.
peoples as a traditional, an originary right, and an originary right judicially is considered to be a right that is before the building of all the other legislation that came to our territory. So our rights are originary and they are unchangeable because we are the originary peoples of this land.
Yeah, and until
that
then,
is beautiful. But since then, we made it to have it in some way on the Constitution. But of course, to have this turn into reality in the society that we live in is really hard. And we still fight for the recognition of indigenous lands. The indigenous territories still are under threat and under attack of many violences since the invasion, the literal invasion of the territory, but also the persecution and murder of indigenous leaders, etc. And in this year, we had to debate a lot the urgency of having regulated the indigenous lands that are under big violence panorama, as for example, those peoples that had their territory invaded first. People around the world has this idea of indigenous peoples in Brazil only in the Amazon rainforest, but we don't have only the Amazon rainforest. We have peoples in all the seaside, in South Brazil, in all the places, in all the cities. We have indigenous communities that have lost their territory, but maintain all the relation and their culture. So they have the right to have some place recognized for them. And sorry, what makes possible the existence of indigenous rights is, first of all, the recognition of our culture, that we have different cultures, and that these cultures direct, I don't know, I'm finding the words, sustain all the ways of relations we have to the world around us and between us. So indigenous territories today worldwide protect more than 82% of biodiversity in the planet. The indigenous lands that are defended, that are protected by indigenous peoples, giving their lives for the protection of this territory, gather more than 82% of the biodiversity on the planet today. And that is possible because of our culture. Because our culture is a culture that respects the cycles of lives, and that is not a culture of exploitation and in the ways of the colonial Western culture that turn into global. And the only thing that is actually global today is garbage. And so we have many things that are implicated into the recognition of indigenous territories. And the recognition of these territories are public policies, but we also need public policies to the continuity of our cultures, because we need to do lots of efforts to educate and civilize the white folks. Those white folks that came one day invading our homes and raping our mothers and killing our fathers and left us to die. And even we survive today, we need to learn these people how to respect other humans and how to respect other cultures. But we need to find ways to make our youth understand that we need them to keep our cultures and our philosophies, our sciences alive for the next generations as well. We are not talking just about culture in a folklorical way, like, oh, look, it's so, Europeans love that word, they call me every time. We are not talking about exotic things. It's not because it is exotic. It's because there is such a great knowledge. It's such a complex science that is unique and that needs to be respected. Our cultures are just as old as any other culture around the world, and we meant the same respect. And so there are many levels of racism that we have to deconstruct. There are many levels of colonization, of colonial views that we have to set down, to set apart, and to re-educate ourselves. And maybe through this re-education, we can find the ways to try to relate to our world around us and to life within and around us in a different way that may not only result in this only thing that is global, that is garbage. Is share the responsibility on the continuity of life and not just share the guilt of the necropolitics, necropresence, the death that is spreading all over the planet. And so that resistance is something that indigenous peoples, even in their cultural diversity, share as a common fight, that as a common mission, as a compromise. And so the indigenous movements show the possibility of gathering into a common struggle together without falling into the fear of the difference, into accepting and embracing diversity, cultural diversity, biodiversity, ways of living together.
Let me move on a little bit. I'm just looking at the time, and these conversations, they seem to have a lot of time given to them, but actually when we come to it, time kind of flies. But I'm interested in this, what appears to be, but I'm sure it isn't, a contradiction or maybe a kind of different lines between your kind of human rights research and your art practice. It seems like your human and indigenous rights kind of work as an activist, as a researcher, etc., stems from a long and kind of difficult tradition. Your father already worked with Mari Juruna, and Juruna himself, it belongs to a kind of a longer tradition of resistance and attempts to kind of secure territory and human rights for the indigenous peoples. And now, if we look at the acceptance, because I'm not going to say the existence, I would say the acceptance, the reception of the work of indigenous artists within the contemporary art world, which is a kind of a social group in itself, very kind of exclusive and excluding. That is a kind of a more recent event, shamefully. Nevertheless, in looking at your work, there is a kind of notable kind of celebratory aspect to it, compared to the more denunciatory kind of aspect of your human rights and your indigenous activism. Could you speak a little bit about why that is the case? Why isn't your work kind of following this kind of more kind of denunciatory kind of what we would kind of recognize as clearly political? It seems to me that it kind of it focuses more on a kind of a symbolic a celebratory kind of aspect of indigenous iconography, culture and heritage, rather than sticking to the kind of denunciation of the atrocities that have been committed against the indigenous peoples. Perhaps you could speak a little bit about that kind of what could seem or appear like a disjunction.
I think there is a book from Davi Kopenawa that is called the Fall of the Sky.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it's translated in English already.
Yeah.
I
have it here.
Oh, wonderful. Share it. And Kopenawa explains that in Western minds tend to divide everything in little boxes. So he says white people are the people of the little boxes. Everything they set in little boxes apart. So is a society that is based on exclusion.
Mm-hmm. Categorization.
Yeah.
Mm.
Is excluding and cutting all the relations, and you put in the little box, and then you in the little closet, and then you close the closet, and people may be happy if they are in higher rows or etc. For me, and I believe for most of indigenous cultures, everything is really deeply connected. There is no way to separate art from science or from politics. Everything is an exercise. So my speech and my actions as a researcher, as a human rights defender, are not far from what I paint or draw or present on an exhibition. The context that I present of my work, it defines my work as well, not only visually, because the historical context of this is really important to understand what is the nature of the work. And many people ask me why I don't have yet shown images denouncing the suffering and the pain of genocide of indigenous peoples. But sometimes it's more difficult to show the resistance, the continuity of our thoughts, of our science, of our cultures. That is really more rare, because there are very few people that maintain the ancestral knowledge. And I had the opportunity to be born in a family that gathered a very special knowledge for generations, and I am aware that I am part of the continuity of the knowledge that is passed to the next generations. And so my work, through the celebration of the culture of my people, but my nation, but not only mine, also other nations, is I am reaching spaces of debate on our knowledge that are in turn, as for example, what does art mean for us? What is Hori? Hori is untranslatable to any Western language. There is no word in Latin, nor French, nor Spanish, nor English, nor German for Hori. Hori is a dimension that exists in Tukano, but we can find other indigenous words in other indigenous nations for the same thing. It's more translatable to Hunikuin, to Ashaninka, to Quechua, to other indigenous nations, than for the Westerns. Europeans don't have the understanding yet. And it's difficult to reach that point. But the thing is that we cannot wait for the white people to try to translate and understand everything in our culture. We need to develop our knowledge and our sciences and our internal discussions. We need to keep going on arguing our internal questions, philosophical questions. So it's not just about this celebration, but is the activation, is not just about the cosmovision of the indigenous peoples, but the cosmopotency.
The cosmos, sorry?
Potence. Cosmopotência. I invented that word because I learned to love the word cosmovision. I took like 2 years to understand the word epistemology. I turned down to the Greeks and to understand what is episteme and everything. And what I understood is that the epistemology is like the science of understanding the human thought, how we understand the world around us. So every culture has a way to understand the world. And somebody invented, I don't know who exactly they invented that word, the word cosmovision. Cosmovision is a beautiful word because it shows that indigenous peoples don't just, they take a look to the cosmos. It's stratospheric. Is as a long view to the universe. But the cosmovision is like a vision that contemplates the universe. And now is how we dialogue to the universe, how we listen to the universe, how we talk to the universe, learn the language of the universe, and create universe within ourselves. And that is cosmopotence. It's the ability of creating universe and being aware that we are agency in the universe, that we are part of the transformation of the universe, that our thought, it has the strength. It doesn't matter if you understand it as spiritual or cultural or magnetic strength, but it has a strength. It is alive. And so the expression of our life is the most potent way of resistance, is the most potent way of denouncing. It is a political action.
So you would put the activity of participating within the cultural field of contemporary art as an act of resistance in itself, as an act of. You mentioned once.
Used to say that indigenous contemporary art is like, como fala, armadilha?
It's a trap.
It's a trap. It's a trap for the white folks. It's a trap because they had always denied that we were always contemporary. If we are here, it's because we always were here. We are not ghosts from the past. We are not zombies. We are not vampires, not fairies. We are on the same timeline. We are on the same planet, on the same age. We have access to the same technologies. We have the same capability. We have the same intelligence. We have the same age as civilizations. And so we are contemporary as well, and we have much to offer and to be recognized. And there is no space to have anybody, anyone speaking for us instead of us. Now we are free and totally armed, equipped to speak for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We granted our right to our dignity just manifesting it. And so all the spaces need to be not open. We have already our place in every space, and also in art. The way how indigenous peoples were represented in art history, in Western art history, and how our art, our cultural expressions were treated as minor, or in technique, or in historical contexts, or minor cultural manifestations, is all a syndrome of the racism that maintains the logics of power of colonialism. And we are done with that. There is no place, there is no argument to maintain that logic. And so indigenous artists are going into the museums and into the schools and into school books and into the galleries to participate to the writing and painting of the histories that were not told, but that are also real, and that might be educating the next generations.
Yeah, and I find that in doing so, in this kind of belated but almost en masse arrival of in what you are calling indigenous, or Jaide as well called indigenous contemporary art, also kind of puts into question the entire canon of Brazilian modern and contemporary art, in my opinion. It questions this idea that has kind of defined Brazilian art for decades now. This idea that Brazilian art is intrinsically related to the manifesto of anthropophagy, which was a kind of 1928 manifesto that drew on the figure of the indigenous, the so-called cannibal, the devourer of the European, as a kind of a defining symbolic kind of gesture of Brazilian culture. So Brazilian culture was seen as kind of appropriating European culture. But by doing that, there's a kind of a separation between Brazil as a nation, as a culture, and Europe. Now, these Osório de Andrade and the author of the painter here on the right, Tarsilo do Amaral, they were elite European Brazilians, defining anthropophagy as a kind of unifying aspect, almost kind of an essential aspect of Brazilian culture. What the arrival of indigenous artists within the contemporary scene does is to completely deny this kind of homogeneity of Brazilian culture. You're kind of claiming difference within that culture. You're claiming your difference within that culture. And this performance that you did with Jaide Isbel I believe it was at the Pinacoteca in, was it 2020? Kind of by standing in front of Tarsila's iconic kind of anthropophagia painting, you are kind of acting that denial, acting that refusal to accept this homogeneity of Brazilian culture. Would you say that is correct, or is this kind of me kind of fantasizing about the questioning of anthropophagy?
I don't know if the thing is the denial. Of course, I have lots of critics to the way how art history in Brazil was written.
Mm-hmm.
But there is kind of this phenomenon that all colonial countries live. That is the effort of creating a national canon. Yeah, thank you. A national canon. That is some, and that is a reality, not just for the countries in Americas or the South Americas, but I believe also in Europe. The creation of the idea of a nation it tends to homogenize the idea of a national institution, a national culture, and creates lots of allegories to represent the idea of a nation. And this allegoria is literally painted and sculpted and present in all the long of the art history everywhere. As for example, how the continents are represented under the Queen Victoria sculpture in the middle of London. Or it might be Napoleon, or it might be Christopher Columbus, or the idea of the discoverers, and then the poor little colonies with this uncivilized people, and this speech, this narrative is a political option, a political strategy to keep those people under the domain of the fear and violence, and the service to attend the interests of those that were self-known colonizers and masters of everything, So Brazil has generations of mythologies on the national identity. One of the greatest myths is the myth of the three races, that we say we are the mixtures of the white, the black, and the Indian, the Europeans, the Africans, and the natives. And it's a beautiful love story, but no. It never was a love story, because the Black and indigenous populations still testify that there is no love story behind the fact that Brazil has the largest Black population outside of Africa, for example, because it was the most important port of slave traffic during centuries, and the last country to end slavery in the world. They doesn't accept neither the historical wars and attacks to to end the indigenous populations. They are not told in the storybooks. They are not told at school, and they are not present at the galleries and the museums that illustrate all those speeches. And so everything is politics. So at the Pinacoteca of São Paulo, that is what we made that in the performance with Janeiro, is kind of our it's like our national gallery. We have a collection of very important historical masterpieces of art that point the historical moments of Brazil. As for example, we have paintings of the discovery of Brazil, between a lots of guillemets. We have paintings of the foundation of the village of São Paulo, the first mass with the Christians evangelizing the Indians and saving their souls, all the speeches of colonization that are actually the proof of the genocide that was committed. So marking a standing and living incarnated indigenous presence in those places, those kind of museums, is extremely radical. People went mad. People went like they didn't knew what to say or what to do, because who in hell would have the courage to face Tarsila do Amaral? It's like facing Picasso. Who could stand in front of that? Well, we do. But that is not denying Tarsila, that is not denying the modernist movements, but that is recontextualizing, that is enlarging the context, enlarging the historical context, enlarging the critical theory on art history by other approaches that were not taken before.
Yeah, the way I see this performance, it kind of reveals the this idea of the three races that formed the Brazilian people: the European, the Indians, and the Black Africans. Tarsila's painting, this painting in particular, kind of refers to two other paintings of hers. One is A Negra, the Black woman, which is the figure on the left with the kind of extended breast. And the other one is Abapuru, the figure on the right, which refers clearly to the indigenous anthropophagite. What your performance reveals by placing a mirror facing the public is the third kind of constitutive race in this kind of triangle, the kind of the audience for the picture. What Tarsila kind of does here is kind of, she presents the other Brazilian races whilst assuming herself as the kind of the white kind of superior, the race kind of that is entitled to look and admire a work of art such as this. And your performance kind of reveals that kind of artifice, that apparatus, that kind of, essentially, I wouldn't say she is racist, but she is kind of, she carries that racism that is intrinsic to.
Por que falar constrangimento?
Constrangimento. I'm not sure. I'm stuck. I'm not sure. I'll have to pass on that one. But
a intenção é constranger mesmo.
It's cringing, I think. To cringe, to be kind of embarrassed, to kind of like.
Yeah. The thing is that indigenous presence, when we are walking with that kind of truth, that big truth that is unconturnable, it makes people, those white, rich, empowered people, really shy, really shy. And so this mirror is that kind of garage mirror, you know, it's the convex mirror that turns everything little. So it isn't a mirror to look to yourself. It is a mirror to look to the world around you.
To the others. To see the others coming at you, maybe. From
Yeah,
behind the corner.
everything around you, not just other people, the world around you. And it's a mirror that reminds us that we are really little, that the world is bigger. So it's and it's like a shield, and you know, we have there is this image of the first Europeans arriving on the shore and exchanging mirrors with native people, because they had the idea that we never looked at us in a mirror and we were, wow, this is magic or something like that. And we even have people that believe that we exchanged our territory and our souls for mirrors. But are you sure that we look ourselves into the mirror, we are seeing the same thing that the other is seeing? I don't know if I am expressing myself well. I will try in Portuguese and you translate. Ok?
I'll
Tá.
try.
Então, é isso, do tipo, o que a gente tá olhando no espelho? Uma coisa meio Alice no País das Maravilhas mesmo, né? Porque assim, tu me dá um espelho, você acha que eu vou ver aquilo que você tá vendo, e não é. Né? Os europeus nos deram espelhos achando que a gente ia ver o que os europeus achavam que estavam vendo de nós. Mas não.
So the Europeans gave us mirrors in the expectation that they would see what they saw in the mirror, but actually that's not true.
No. The Europeans gave us mirrors expecting that we were going to see ourselves,
as
in
they
the
saw
same
you.
way they were looking to us.
Okay, yeah.
But they were always unable to look to us because they couldn't even understand us as human beings. So what is a mirror for? We look at the same mirror, but we see totally different things.
Daiara, I'm a little bit concerned about time and to give the opportunity for people to ask questions.
Yeah.
I mean, unfortunately, I have to kind of mediate between the questions, so it's not directly, but I will read people's questions posed. We have a few. I think we have 5 or 6 questions. There are a few that are kind of yes and no. I think the first question you have more or less answered it, but I'll read it just so that we're kind of being democratic about this. Is there a distinct urban indigenous art or culture in Brazil, or is this part of a traditional matrix? I think you have covered this, but if you want to respond.
Well, listen, that is a very common question. Even if I work with laser, my art is traditional because I am indigenous and I belong to a tradition and I am part of this tradition and I am the continuity of this tradition. So we must pay a lot of attention not to confound, to mistake our definitions on what makes things traditional or contemporary.
You mentioned laser, and it reminded me
Yeah,
of the Nilsson Baniwa
that is an example of Baniwa.
use of laser on monuments that are very problematic in terms of their representation of the indigenous peoples. This is the monument to the Bandeirantes, who were essentially they explored early explorers of Brazil, but their intentions were primarily to enslave and kill in the process indigenous peoples. So they're kind of basically murderers
And
who are
as for example,
celebrated as
when we
these.
project lasers with very, very ancient, millennial,
Mm.
ancient drawings that are present in our sacred
the-
places with laser,
Mm.
that is really old and traditional.
Yeah, the
So
other thing is that the
and the same
Nilsson.
thing, in the same way that when you have someone that still walk and replicate the ancient techniques of basketry or pottery or this singing today, that means that our tradition is really contemporary.
Yeah,
So don't não vamos se perder nessas noções, sabe?
we shouldn't get lost in these kind of notions or categories,
Yeah.
traditional, contemporary, etc. The other question was more a telling off of myself, a former student of mine disagreeing with me when I described the difference between your human rights work and your art as kind of appearing to be to have a disjunction in terms of the denunciation on one side and the celebration on the other. And she, Maria Kirka, doesn't agree with me on that point. I don't think it was addressed to you specifically. I'll go to the next question, which is anonymous. So I'll just read it. This is moving quickly. I really appreciate the art, that the art demonstrates resistance as well as continuity of traditional art stories. I think my question is, how do you feel that the younger generations engage with your art and thus their traditional stories of cultures?
Fala de novo a última parte.
How do you feel that the younger generations engage with your art and therefore their traditional stories and cultures?
Well, by my experience, and it's quite interesting actually, because I am from a region where racism is so present. Like we have our culture so much persecuted that, for example, people don't have the use to paint their bodies. No, it became something really rare. And then I began researching our body paintings with my aunts and my grandfathers, and began painting myself and showing it on Instagram. And at the beginning, people, wow, my family, like my some cousins were like, oh, you're dressing as an Indian, whatever. They came with all the prejudice that were like floating around, trying to shame me
Mm.
because I was painting my body and showing my body painted. But today, we reach a point where they saw that other people, other indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples as well, turned attention to those paintings and said, "Oh, that is beautiful. Wow, I didn't knew you had those paintings as well." And it's actually a lots of historical research that I made. And then my cousins and my brothers came to me to teach them how to paint. And they all became great artists. And so those are experiences on how we are little by little recovering the practice of painting our bodies, understanding what is each design meant to be, or when we use it, or how they are related, and how we communicate through our body paint. And that is possible, that calls the interest of the youth because of this visibility of gaining the space. And I have seen, I still young, but I am already an auntie with 40 years old. I am seeing a generation of artists, of Tukano artists, that is coming after me, after my work, and expanding and understanding the importance of the traditional narratives to building, to work in the art. I was really amazed. I'm really in love with the young girls, the young women that are also exploiting the images of the great grandmother of the universe, that is our creator goddess, and drawing her and telling stories and making the continuity of this practice of the what is not just the oral knowledge, the culture that we kept into orality by
the oral history,
but that this storytelling is also present on our drawings and our bodies, and in the way that we paint our houses, etc. So I paint all my father's house. My cousins are painting. We are raising our children in painted houses. Once again, our children are having the opportunity that our parents didn't have, that is to celebrate their culture and their identity as children. Because my father, my uncles were forbidden of that. And so that is a big cultural change in one generation.
Thank you. I'm going to follow on for the next question from Kate Thorpe. I really appreciate that the art demonstrates resistance as well as continuing traditional art stories. I think my question is, no, I've just read that, sorry, I'm repeating the same question. The use of the mirror reminds me of Velázquez. This is still from Kate Thorpe. It's interesting how we tend to associate images with a kind of the canon of Western art. Do you think this is here I am extrapolating on her comment, on Kate's comment.
What? Qual que é a obra que tu falou?
Ela falou que o espelho lembra de Velázquez. So yes, I think that it's interesting how we tend to kind of identify images or objects with a kind of
that is epistemology.
And how we kind of are kind of conditioned to live within this kind of body of knowledge.
Yeah, that is the power of epistemology. The name of that piece, that art piece, is Cartiri Eoro. That means the mirror of life. So the feather cloak is a direct reference to the ancient Tupinambá feather cloaks that are present only in Europe. In some collections, there are 7 pieces of them, and neither of them is in Brazil, of the original ones. And actually, the red birds that we originally made those cloaks are almost extincted. And so this is a feather cloak that I made using as reference the cloak that is in Bruxelles. And but the story of those cloaks is that they are like como que fala, trancado mesmo, they are locked into
Locked away.
aquariums.
Yeah,
These are
locked on the
the oldest pieces that were kept by the gabinets or curiosités, and they are kept like locked under lots of locks in European museums. And here we lost them almost completely. And so these are like political, como é que fala? São sequestros políticos, né?
They've been a political kidnap, kind of political, not kidnap. My Portuguese, my brain isn't working anymore.
These are because they are not even refugees. They are like political. They were politically arrested by the history of colonization, and they were taken away. And then when they left, we lost lots of our heritage. And so having this living cloak, this living feather cloak, walking freely in a museum that is full of masterpieces of colonization is really radical. And we went in by the front door, and we went out by the front door as well. Like, the museum is not going to catch us into those jails in the same way again. Now, if we go in, it's because we want, and we show us the way we want to be presented. And so the mirror is about all the contrasts of these contexts, the historical context, political context, the theoretical context in the history of art, art critic, and even aesthetics, because we are just open space to another reference that is ours, and we are not obligated. We are not. We are not supposed, neither forced to follow always the Western reference. So that is really interesting.
Yeah, Maria Kirka is again making an association here. She's saying that your performance reminds her of the artist, the Native American artist James Luna, who made interventions in museums in Europe and the United States. I'm not sure if you know who James Luna is,
no.
But there is
but I'd love to.
But there. I mean, I mentioned Jimmy Durham before in this idea of the kind of the indigenous peoples kind of the Americas going beyond the kind of nation state constraints, which is something that I find quite interesting. This kind of
but it's part of the traps, you know. If you put the image of the building in Belo Horizonte, that is the Selva Mãe do Rio Menino. It's jungle mother of the river boy. And it represents a mother with her kid, and it happens that she is the forest and that her kid is a river, because rivers are only born in the forests. And you can imagine the love between the forest and the river. As a mother and a child, as a son and a mother, the mutual love that is shared. And this love is a relation that we have as indigenous peoples with the forest and with the rivers as well. I made this drawing thinking in all of that, and because in that region there was a river that was killed. One of the biggest rivers in Brazil was completely polluted by the rupture of a dam,
The Rio Doce.
the Rio Doce, and it was like one of the largest environmental crimes that happened in this century. And this river is considered by the Krenak people as their grandfather. And by the time my grandfather was 110 years old, and he was almost dying, and he passed away, and I began imagining the childhood of my grandfather that was born in 1910 by the, como fala, cabeceira do rio?
The embankment, no?
By the beginning of the river.
Like the nascente, where the river, the spring, where the river.
Yeah,
I can't remember
where the river springs, like right in the middle of the heart of the forest. And so the childhood of my grandfather was totally different from mine. He was a free boy that grew up plunging and swimming every day, and he was naked and he was free, and he had a childhood that I never get to have, and because of the history of the invasion of our territory. And it's so beautiful seeing people, young children plunging into the river, because that is what they do as children. They have no obligation. They need to help their mothers and take care of each other, but they are playing every day, all day long in the river. And so there are those relations. And then somebody told me, oh, that is a virgin with with Jesus Christ, is the Virgin Mother holding the child. And I was like,
of
what?
course, yeah.
Yeah, and oh, okay. But you know, that image is present and so important in every culture. And I wasn't aware when I made the drawing of that kind of relation, but I actually became happy for that kind of relation before, because the meaning, the feeling that is supposed to walk within society is the same. Is an original love of we as children having nature as mother. And that is the biggest painting made by an indigenous artist in the world. It has 1,000 meters square, and it is the biggest. I hope somebody else can do biggest paintings, but that has a monumental impact that we never had in those cities that are plenty of statues of discoverers and colonizers and politics. Mural painting, street art is the closest we can get to occupy a monumental space as artists in society. So those traps using the Western epistemology, the images that are in Western culture, to try to dialogue to that culture is actually necessary, and I think is smart. It's not because of me, because we need to translate at least some feeling. So I had another painting. I don't know if you have it there, but it's the falling of the sky and the mother of all fights, a queda do céu e a mãe de todas as lutas, that I made for the National Museum. Não, a queda do céu é aquela que parece uma pietà.
I don't have it, no, sorry. Yeah.
Na outra apresentação teria, mas that kinds of it represents kinds of a pietà that is also is the falling of the sky, and there is a body, a dead body, as a sky that fell down, that is held by this feminine figure that is the Mother Earth, that is the mother of all fights. And it looks like a pietà, and it has a direct reference to the pietà, but the title refers directly to the Davi Kopenawa's book,
Yeah,
and all the idea of the falling of the sky,
which is
and
a kind
what does it
of
mean?
which is a kind of cataclysm, the end of the world kind of situation.
Yes, yes. And
Mm.
so it connects. I think it is a space to connect these two of these several narratives, these epistemologies and cosmovisions to work together.
I think that's a very beautiful point in which to finish our conversation, as we've kind of run out of time, with your grandfather jumping into the Hiodosi, becoming the Hiodosi in your picture, and in the Pietà, emerging with the myth of the falling sky. So thank you very much, Daiara. Muito obrigado. And I think this is just the beginning of a conversation. But I hope everyone enjoyed, and please kind of check our forthcoming lectures and events. And also, Daiara has her website, and I'm sure you'll be happy to check out more examples of her work and her activities, research, etc. So thanks everyone for coming, and thank you especially Daiara Tukano for participating. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity.
I'm sure we'll speak soon.
Yeah. You know, Indigenous speaks a lot. We have a different time.